Welcome to NBA Jam Tatman QC on Fire Edition. Boom shakalaka.
Happy Little Games. Recreating movie-style action inside of a video game is something that developers have been attempting to do for quite some time. It started with E.T. and Alien for the Atari 2600, with both of them having been released in 1982. There have been a number of attempts along the way with varying degrees of success. Indiana Jones was also released for the 2600, but due to the primitive graphics, you almost always had to refer to the game's manual to see who and what the images depicted in the game actually were. Dragon's Lair was also released in 1983, although that really wasn't a game in the traditional sense. Other titles throughout the years that have tried to meld these two mediums together included Ninja Gaiden with its cutscenes, and even newer titles such as Uncharted. One game that did just that, but on a grander scale, even without the benefit of a licensed IP, was Cliffhanger Edward Randy, or simply known as Edward Randy. Now, based on the title, you would think this game would involve Sylvester Stallone clinging to the edge of a cliff by his fingertips, but that's not the case. This game was released back in 1990 by Data East, and it's one of those games you've probably never played, but you most definitely should. What was the inspiration for this game? What was so unique about the health system? Why wasn't this game ever converted to home systems? What is the connection between this game and Gunstar Heroes? So hold on to the seat of your pants, because this is the history of the Cliffhanger Edward Randy. The company of Data East, or abbreviated as DECO, was founded in Japan in the year of 1976 by Tetsuo Fukuda. The company released a number of arcade games worldwide, with its US division opening in 1979. They were the first company to introduce an interchangeable game system, most notably the Deco cassette system. This was a full 10 years before companies such as SNK were doing it. Now, any fan of my channel will tell you that game companies ripping off popular IPs was a common practice all over the world, but especially back in the early days. As far as Data East is concerned, it wasn't just video games they were taking inspiration from, such as Lock and Chase being a pretty direct ripoff of Pac-Man, but other popular genres such as TV shows and movies. The company didn't just develop its own arcade games, but also distributed titles they felt would resonate with the general audience. Thanks to the success of martial arts flicks, they jumped on the bandwagon and distributed Kung Fu Master and Karate Champ. Due to the success of Japanese pro wrestling, and right around the time Hulkamania was going to explode, the company released Tag Team Wrestling. As soon as Rambo became a thing, the company released Heavy Barrel, which in turn was inspired by Ikari Warriors. The company was even responsible for the best unofficial James Bond video game, Sly Spy Secret Agent, that is, until GoldenEye was released for the Nintendo 64. Speaking of Sly Spy, it was such a direct rip that at the start of the game you were allowed to enter a 3-number identification, and even some of the bosses from the James Bond lore, such as Jaws, have been included. If you are interested in more info on Sly Spy, I did a video on it a few years back. When it came to the development of Edward Randy, the project was started as an experimental action title held by Minoru Sano, who would later bring us the fantastic Sega Saturn game Terra Diver. A number of other designers were involved, including Hitomi Fujiwara, handling all the pixel art. Hiro Nakamura designed the project, which was created in conjunction with Joe and Mac Caveman Ninja, as well as a sequel to Karate Champ. Mr. Nakamura wasn't interested in an action arcade game, but instead wanted to develop a shoot-'em-up title. However, Data East turned him down as there was another shooter already in development, which later became Boogie Wings. Due to his inexperience with fighting games, Mr. Nakamura passed on Karate Champ 2, so he was left with Edward Randy. When it came to actually planning the title, Staff members introduced their favorite things into the game design document that read like a sequel to Indiana Jones. This was easier said than done. The main character of Edward Randy would use a whip as his primary weapon, but the team were having trouble implementing how to use it. This was so difficult, in fact, that the game was almost scrapped early on. However, staff members went to the higher-ups at Data East pleading their case that this would be a viable project. Mr. Nakamura was instructed to make a sample level, and after seeing the game in action, the higher-ups finally greenlit the project. As I mentioned, the staff essentially wanted to create an Indiana Jones type game, stealing some of the best bits from the beloved franchise, including the cinematic style presentation. They were also well aware that no other game had captured that cinematic feeling companies have been going for since the very beginning. In addition to the obvious Indiana Jones influence, other genres such as manga and even the anime Lupin III, especially the way Lupin runs bow-legged. There were also thinly veiled homages to other classic Hollywood filmmakers such as Buster Keaton. The huge, insane action pieces were extremely memorable, but they came at a cost for Mr. Nakamura and his staff. They had a number of difficulties getting things working properly, and as a result, the PCB contained 5 times the memory size over previous releases from Data East. The higher-ups also requested a second character be playable for added revenue. The game spent a year in development, but team members have stated that Edward Randy was the most fun they ever had working on a game. The developers of the game would constantly say, "Think of Edward Randy like watching a movie that you could actually control." They were very conscious of movies when making this title, and it definitely shows. The arcade game was a huge influence on another classic game by Treasure, which is Gunstar Heroes. Some of the designers who worked on this game would later go on to work for Treasure and create Gunstar Heroes. Speaking of, the final battle on top of the biplane feels very much like the fight against Orange. The character designer Tetsuhiko Han Kikuchi was such a fan of the arcade game they named a couple of different characters in Guardian Heroes, Edward and Randy. One of the original programmers on this game would go on to work at Konami and would directly pay homage to the final boss in the game Contra for the Sega Genesis. The game sold 4,000 cabinets worldwide, with 2,000 of those in Japan alone. It did not make much of a splash here in the States, but it was scheduled to be released on the Atari ST and Amiga, and believe it or not, the Commodore 64 and Spectrum. Nothing ever came of these ports though. It was also scheduled to be released on the Sega Saturn, but again, it was never released. The graphics are absolutely amazing with a ton of 2D and 3D effects. It's one of those games that you've probably never played, but you most definitely should. The audio was also fantastic, with excellent music by Akira Takimoto and Hiroaki Yoshida, who did the sound effects. Due to the design team struggling with getting the game to where it needed to be, development time took almost a year, which was quite a lot for an arcade game back in 1990. As a matter of fact, the game barely made its deadline, with Data East finally having to step in and instructed Mr. Nakamura to stop development and finish the project. They were still working on the game right until it made its debut at the 1990 Japan Amusement Expo. Due to this game being rushed out the door, a number of things went unused but were still found in the arcade ROMs, such as the original background title screen, a soldier on a toilet, an unused stone disc that features the prism, as well as different graphics for the various cutscenes. Speaking of the cutscenes, these were all removed from the World Revision 3 ROM set, which is what most people are familiar with. The Japanese version included a slightly longer opening as well as cutscenes in between each level. Since they decided to remove these, you really didn't know what the heck was going on with the story. Granted, all of the text is in Japanese, but at least you have pictures to follow along. This is perfect for a guy like me who only looks at picture books. Rumor has it the cutscenes were taken out of the World Revision to speed up the game and increase revenue. These cutscenes, however, are a must. If you just went off the original opening and ending, you wouldn't have any idea of how Edward Randy met up with Charlotte or the issue he had with his girlfriend. For anyone who is interested, I have included the cutscenes from the Japanese version at the end of this video. The level layout in the Japanese version is also different, with you starting on the biplane level and then moving on to the speedboat. Edward Randy, or the cliffhanger Edward Randy as it's known here in the States, whipped its way into arcades in 1990. As the story goes, sometime in the 1930s, in an unspecified European country, a Nazi-like general known as the Dark Ogre is attempting to build a secret weapon of mass destruction. One of the elderly scientists escapes after learning he was being manipulated by the general. He gives his granddaughter a prism, which is a stone that is an important piece of his research. Charlotte is then chased by the army and is accidentally saved by Edward Randy. Thus begins the adventure. Edward Randy is a 1 or 2 player action beat-em-up game where you have to fight an insane amount of enemies. The game takes place across 7 stages with balls-to-the-wall action and some insane set pieces to boot. The bosses in this game are absolutely massive and a lot of the time fill up the entire screen. Your weapon of choice is a whip, and although you don't sport a fedora, you can clearly see the influence of a certain whip-snapping, wisecracking, swashbuckling hero. Edward controls fairly well, with one button for your whip and the other button for jumping. Your whip can be used in 8 directions by pushing the joystick in the appropriate direction and pressing the button. The range is long for the whip, but it is a bit on the slow side. When you are close enough to an enemy, rather than use the whip, you'll resort to using fisticuffs instead. The jump button is made for climbing platforms or jumping from vehicle to vehicle. Edward can also slide into enemies to knock them out. You can also use your whip to swing and kick enemies into a watery grave. Speaking of a watery grave, when you are on the speedboat, you can get knocked off, but thankfully you are transported back to the top of the boat, although you will lose some health. Similar to a trick that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 would pull off a couple of years later, on certain occasions when enemies are killed, Edward will throw them into the screen. Speaking of the health, the game utilizes a rather unique system in which your energy is tied to your score. The more enemies you kill, the more it increases. The more damage you take though, and it will go down. As I mentioned, if you fall off a boat, plane, or car, you only take a small amount of damage. If you are a fan of the Sega Super Scalar arcade games, you will absolutely love the car and plane levels. Your character travels towards the camera with everything zooming by, appearing, surprise surprise, as if you were actually watching an action movie. The levels you encounter are Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, Stage 4, Stage 5. Stage 6. And finally, Stage 7. The bosses don't appear to have any names, so we'll just call them River Action Boss. The Getaway Boss. The Caves Boss. Biplane Action Boss. After defeating the final boss, the ending is shown, letting you know that the plane crashed onto the armored vessel. You have saved the prism and returned it to Charlotte. There is one thing you forgot though, which was your girlfriend, and to reward you for your heroic deeds, she gives you a nice smack across the face. After this, the game is over. As I previously mentioned, here are the cutscenes from the Japanese version. In the world revision, the levels are not named. In the Japanese version, the translated names are Stage 1, Sudden Climax, Stage 2, Hundreds of Adventures, Stage 3, I Am the Trump Card, Stage 4, 100 Mile Hard Run, Stage 5, Desperate Situation, Stage 6, Go for Broke, and Stage 7, Climax at Last. In Japan, the original soundtrack was released on CD by Data East as part of a 2-pack along with Super Burger Time. If you are a fan of pixel art and classic video games, you should definitely check this out. It has a ton of action, and in 2-player mode, it's a wild party game. The game is fun to play and was one of the first arcade games to bring together movies and video games into one cohesive play experience. If you've never had the chance to experience the adventures of Edward Randy, be sure and give this game a shot. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. If you would like to contribute but not sign up for my Patreon, you can always click the donate button up above. Thanks everyone for watching.